Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The moment the old man's eyes met mine, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. His gaze held a hunger that chilled me to the bone, and as he beckoned us deeper into the woods, I realized we weren't following him to help. We were being led into a trap. It had started as a routine hike, just another weekend adventure for my best friend, Jakes, and me. We'd been exploring the backwoods of the Appalachian Mountains for years, always seeking out new trails and hidden wonders. This particular day, we decided to venture off the marked paths, confident in our abilities to navigate the wilderness. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, a gentle breeze rustling through the colorful leaves. We'd been hiking for hours, joking and chatting, when we first heard the call for help. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of a nearby stream, but unmistakable. A man's voice, tinged with desperation. "Help! Is anyone there?" Jake and I exchanged glances. We'd been trained in wilderness first aid and had helped lost hikers before. Without hesitation, we veered off our planned route, following the sound of the voice. As we pushed through dense underbrush, the calls grew louder. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing. There, leaning against a gnarled old oak tree, was an elderly man. He looked to be in his late 70s, with wispy white hair and deeply lined face. His clothes were oddly formal for a hike, a tweed jacket, pressed slacks, and what looked like dress shoes. But what struck me most were his eyes. Even from a distance, they seemed too bright, too alert for someone supposedly in distress. "Oh, thank goodness," the old man said, his voice suddenly strong and clear. "I thought I'd be stuck out here forever." Jake, always the more outgoing of us, stepped forward. "Are you all right, sir? Are you hurt?" The old man waved a hand dismissively. No, just lost. These old legs aren't what they used to be, and I'm afraid I've gotten myself quite turned around." Something about his demeanor set me on edge. He didn't seem injured or even particularly tired. And those eyes, they never stopped moving, darting between Jake and me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "We can help you back to the trailhead," I offered, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "It's probably about 2 hours back the way we came." The old man's face fell. "Oh dear, I'm not sure I can manage such a long walk, but I know there's a ranger station much closer. If you could just help me there, I'd be ever so grateful." Jake and I exchanged glances. We hadn't seen any signs of a ranger station, but it was possible we'd missed it, and if it meant getting this unsettling old man to safety quicker, it seemed worth a try. "All right," Jake said, "lead the way, and we'll help you along." The old man's face split into a wide grin, revealing teeth that seemed just a bit too sharp. "Excellent. It's just this way, not far at all." As we set off, following the old man deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a huge mistake. The forest seemed to grow denser, the light dimming despite it being early afternoon. The cheerful bird song that had accompanied our earlier hike faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. "I don't like this," I whispered to Jake as we walked. "Something feels off." He nodded, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by caution. "I know what you mean. Let's just get him to the station and get out of here." But as we walked, the promised ranger station never materialized. The old man led us down game trails and through thickets, moving with a speed and sureness that belied his apparent frailty. Every time we asked how much further, he'd gesture vaguely ahead and say, "Not far now, just a bit more." An hour passed, then 2. The forest grew darker and more forbidding. Strange shapes seemed to flit at the edges of my vision, gone when I turned to look. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying a musty, rotting scent. Finally, Jake called a halt. "Look, sir, I think we're lost. Maybe we should turn back and try to find the main trail." The old man turned to face us, and I had to stifle a gasp. His face had changed subtly, the lines deeper, the skin almost gray, and his eyes, they glowed with an inner light that was definitely not human. "Oh, we're not lost at all," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "In fact, we're exactly where we need to be." As if on cue, howls erupted from the woods around us. Dark shapes moved in the undergrowth, circling us. I caught glimpses of matted fur, of yellowed fangs and glowing eyes. What is this?" I stammered, pressing my back against Jake's. The old man's grin widened impossibly, splitting his face almost in half. "This, my young friends, is a hunting ground, and you are the prey." His body began to change, twisting and elongating. Clothes tore as fur sprouted across his skin. In moments, where the old man had stood was now a monstrous wolf-like creature, easily 7 feet tall on its hind legs. "Run," Jake whispered, his voice tight with terror. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. All that mattered was getting away from the horror behind us. Howls filled the air, and I could hear heavy bodies pursuing us through the woods. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Just as I thought we couldn't go on, we burst out of the tree line and found ourselves at the edge of a steep ravine. At the bottom, maybe 50 feet down, a river rushed over jagged rocks. "We have to jump," Jake said, his eyes wild with fear and adrenaline. I looked at the raging water below, then back at the woods where inhuman shapes were closing in. "We'll die if we jump from this height." "We'll die for sure if we don't," he countered. He was right. I nodded, took his hand, and together we leaped into the void. The impact with the water was like hitting concrete. The cold shocked the breath from my lungs, and for a moment, I was sure I was going to drown. But survival instinct kicked in, and I clawed my way to the surface. Jake was a few feet away, sputtering and gasping. We locked eyes, sharing a moment of relief that we'd survived the fall. But our reprieve was short-lived. A howl from above drew our attention. The werewolf, for that's what I now knew it to be, stood at the edge of the ravine, its monstrous form silhouetted against the darkening sky. For a moment, I thought it would jump after us. Instead, it threw back its head and let out a bone-chilling howl. The sound echoed off the ravine walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. We let the current carry us downstream, too exhausted to do more than keep our heads above water. Eventually, we managed to drag ourselves onto a rocky bank, shivering and shell-shocked. What was that thing?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head, unable to find words to describe the horror we'd just escaped. It took us hours to find our way back to civilization, stumbling through the woods in wet clothes, jumping at every sound. When we finally reached a road and flagged down a passing car, the kindly older couple who stopped looked at us like we were madmen. We told the police a sanitized version of events, that we'd gotten lost and fallen into the river while trying to find our way back. They scolded us for going off trail but seemed relieved we were okay. No one believed our mumblings about monstrous old men and werewolves. It's been years since that day, but the memory haunts me still. Jake and I don't talk about it much, but I know he feels it too. The lingering fear, the knowledge that something ancient and evil lurks in those woods. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can hear that old man's voice calling out for help. And I wonder, with a chill down my spine, how many other unsuspecting hikers have been lured into his trap. How many weren't as lucky as we were. So if you're ever hiking in the deep woods and you hear a call for help, think twice before you follow. Because sometimes, the real monster isn't the one that bears its fangs. It's the one that wears a friendly face and asks for your help. And remember, not all who wander in the woods are lost. Some are exactly where they want to be, waiting for their next victim to stumble into their grasp. The crackle of the campfire couldn't drown out the whisper in my head. "You're not alone." I'd been hearing it for days now, a constant reminder that something out there was watching, waiting, hunting me. As I huddled closer to the flames, I knew that tomorrow would bring another desperate attempt to lose my unseen pursuer. But deep down, I feared it was already too late. It all started 5 days ago. I'm an experienced solo hiker, used to spending weeks in the wilderness with nothing but my backpack and my thoughts for company. This trip was supposed to be a chance to clear my head after a messy breakup and some trouble at work. Little did I know it would turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The first 2 days were uneventful. I made good progress along the trail, enjoying the solitude and the breathtaking views of the mountain range. On the third morning, I woke up feeling off. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something had changed overnight. As I packed up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to rationalize it, probably just some wildlife curious about the human intruder. But as I hiked that day, the feeling intensified. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig made me jump. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest, usually so peaceful, seemed alive with menace. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. Just before dawn, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching of leaves, like footsteps circling my tent. My heart pounded as I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The steps completed a full circle and then faded away into the pre-dawn silence. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and peek out, there was no sign of anyone or anything. But right in front of my tent flap was a small pile of pine cones, arranged in a perfect triangle. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that some animal had dropped them there. But deep down, I knew better. This was deliberate. This was a message. I broke camp in record time and hit the trail hard, pushing myself to cover more ground than I had originally planned. All day, the feeling of being watched persisted. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. As the sun began to set, I realized I had a problem. In my haste to put distance between myself and whatever was following me, I had veered off my planned route. I was in a part of the wilderness I didn't recognize, with no idea how to get back to familiar terrain. I found a small clearing to set up camp, choosing a spot with good visibility in all directions. As I ate my dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, I tried to come up with a plan. In the morning, I decided I would backtrack to where I'd gone off course. It would cost me a day, but it was better than getting more lost. That night was the worst yet. The feeling of being watched was so intense it was almost a physical sensation, like icy fingers trailing down my spine. I lay awake for hours, my hand clutching the small canister of bear spray that was my only weapon. Just as exhaustion was finally overtaking me, I heard it again, those soft, deliberate footsteps. This time, they didn't circle my tent. They came right up to it, pausing right outside the thin fabric wall by my head. I held my breath, my whole body rigid with fear. There was a soft scratching sound, and then the footsteps retreated. It wasn't until morning that I saw what my nocturnal visitor had left. A crude stick figure, about a foot tall, stuck into the ground beside my tent. That was when I knew for certain this was no animal. Something intelligent, something that wanted me to know it was there, was stalking me through this wilderness. I abandoned all pretense of following my original hiking plan. My only goal now was to get out of these woods as quickly as possible. I headed downhill, figuring it would eventually lead me to a road or a town, but it soon became clear that my pursuer had other ideas. Whenever I thought I was making good progress, I'd find my path blocked by a fallen tree that hadn't been there minutes before, or a sudden rock slide that forced me to detour. Each obstacle drove me further off course, deeper into unfamiliar territory. By the fourth night, I was exhausted, scared, and hopelessly lost. I made camp in a small grove of trees, too tired to even bother with my tent. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the stars peeking through the canopy, I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they were joined by something else, a low, guttural humming. The sound raised the hair on the back of my neck. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. It circled my camp, always just out of sight, for what felt like hours. I clutched my bear spray, eyes wide in the darkness, certain that at any moment, my stalker would finally reveal itself. But it never did. As suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped, and the forest fell silent. When dawn broke, I found another gift, a crude circle of stones around my sleeping bag, with a small pile of fresh berries in the center. The message was clear. I could have been killed in my sleep, but instead, I was being fed, I was being toyed with. And that brings me to tonight, my 5th night in this never-ending nightmare. I'm sitting by my campfire, jumping at every shadow, every sound. I've been walking all day, but I have no idea if I'm any closer to civilization. My food is running low, and I'm not sure how much longer I can keep going. But giving up isn't an option. Whatever's out there, whatever wants me, I can't let it win. I have to keep moving, keep fighting, keep hoping that somehow I'll find my way out of these woods. As the fire dies down to embers, I hear it again, that soft crunching of leaves. But this time, it's not circling, it's coming closer. My hand tightens on the bear spray as a figure emerges from the darkness at the edge of my camp. For a moment, I think it's human. It's roughly the right shape and size. But as it steps into the fading firelight, I realize how wrong I am. Its body is emaciated, skin stretched tight over an elongated frame. Patchy fur covers parts of its body, while other areas are hairless and scarred. Its face is a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with sunken eyes that glow faintly in the dim light. It cocks its head, regarding me with an unsettling intelligence. Then, to my horror, it speaks. "You've led us on quite a chase," it says, its voice a rasping whisper. "But the game is over now. It's time to come home." As it takes another step forward, I hear more movement in the woods around me. More figures emerge, each as twisted and horrifying as the first. I'm surrounded. In that moment, I realize the terrible truth. I was never meant to escape these woods. This was never about the hunt. It was about recruitment. These things, whatever they are, want to make me one of them. As they close in, I make a desperate choice. I spray the bear spray in a wide arc, creating a temporary barrier of stinging mist. In the confusion, I snatch up my backpack and run, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. I can hear them behind me, their inhuman shrieks echoing through the trees. I run until my lungs burn and my legs feel like they're on fire. But I don't stop. I can't stop. I don't know how long I've been running or where I am. The trees all look the same in the darkness, but I know one thing for certain: I can't let them catch me. I won't become one of them, so I keep running, even as I hear them getting closer. I run, and I pray that somewhere ahead, there's a way out of these endless woods. I run, because the alternative is too horrifying to contemplate. And as I run, I make a vow to myself. If I survive this, if I somehow make it back to civilization, I'll warn others. I'll tell them about the things that lurk in the deep woods, the creatures that were once human but are now something else entirely. I'll make sure no one else ever has to experience the terror of being hunted, day after day, by an unseen predator. But first, I have to survive. I have to escape. And so I run, deeper into the night, with the sound of inhuman footsteps close behind. The rain fell in sheets, drenching me to the bone, but the old man's suit remained perfectly dry. As he stood there, unnaturally still on the muddy trail, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was very, very wrong, and I was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. I'm an avid hiker, always seeking out new trails and challenges. That's what brought me to this remote path in the Cascade Mountains on a dreary autumn day. The forecast had called for light showers, but as I drove to the trailhead, the sky opened up. I almost turned back, but stubbornness got the better of me. I'd driven 2 hours to get here. I wasn't going to let a little rain stop me. The first hour of the hike was miserable but uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, the canopy offering little protection from the downpour. My boots squelched with every step, and water ran in rivulets down my face. But I pressed on, telling myself the view at the summit would be worth it. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw him, an elderly man, probably in his late 70s or early 80s, standing stock still about 50 yards ahead. He wore a crisp black suit, a red bow tie, and polished dress shoes, an outfit more suited to a fancy restaurant than a muddy mountain trail. But it wasn't just his inappropriate attire that set alarm bells ringing in my head. It was the fact that despite the torrential rain, he was completely, impossibly dry. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things, but when I opened my eyes, he was still there, as dry as a bone in the middle of a downpour. "Hello?" I called out, my voice nearly drowned by the rain. "Are you okay, sir?" No response. He didn't even seem to breathe. I took a few cautious steps forward. As I got closer, I could make out more details. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with liver spots dotting his exposed hands and face. Wispy white hair was combed over a balding pate, and his eyes. I couldn't quite make them out, but something about them seemed off. When I was about 20 feet away, he suddenly snapped to life, like a wind-up toy that had been activated. His head turned towards me with an unnatural smoothness, and I found myself staring into eyes that were completely, utterly black. "Hello, my dear," he said, his voice incongruously cheerful. "I seem to have lost my way. Would you be so kind as to assist me?" Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but a lifetime of social conditioning kicked in. Sure," I heard myself say. "Where are you trying to go?" He smiled, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp. "Oh, just down the mountain, but I'm afraid I've gotten quite turned around. Perhaps you could show me the way." I hesitated. The rational part of my brain was throwing up red flag after red flag, but another part was intrigued. How was he staying dry? Why was he up here dressed like that? And those eyes? "I can point you in the right direction," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The trailhead is about an hour back that way." I gestured down the path I'd come from. "Oh no, my dear," he said, taking a step closer. "I'm afraid I'll need you to guide me personally. You see, my eyesight isn't what it used to be." As he moved, I noticed something else odd. Despite the muddy trail, his shoes left no prints. "I'm sorry," I said, backing away slowly, "but I'm heading up to the summit. Good luck finding your way down." I turned to go, my heart pounding, but before I could take 2 steps, he was suddenly in front of me, moving faster than should have been possible for a man his age, or any human for that matter. "I'm afraid I must insist," he said, his voice losing its cheerful tone. "You see, I've been waiting a very long time for someone like you to come along." I tried to sidestep him, but he matched my movement with that same unnatural speed. "What do you mean, someone like me?" I asked, stalling for time as I looked for an escape route. He tilted his head, regarding me with those pitch-black eyes. "Someone alone, someone no one will miss for a while, someone who can help me get home." As he spoke, his face began to change. The skin seemed to melt, revealing something underneath that was decidedly not human. I caught a glimpse of gray, scaly flesh before I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the trail in my desperation to get away. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but terror drove me on. I could hear him behind me, moving through the woods with an ease that defied his apparent age and attire. "You can't run forever, my dear," his voice called out, somehow right next to my ear despite him being behind me. "I've waited centuries for this chance. A few more minutes won't matter." Centuries? What the hell was I dealing with here? I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Just as I was about to collapse, I burst out of the tree line and found myself at the edge of a cliff. Far below, a river rushed over jagged rocks. It was at least a 100-foot drop, certain death if I jumped. I turned to face my pursuer, ready to fight if I had to. But the old man, or whatever he was nowhere to be seen. The woods were silent, save for the pounding rain and my own ragged breathing. For a long moment, I stood there, muscles tensed, waiting for him to appear, but nothing happened. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was this some sort of stress-induced hallucination? Just as I was starting to think I'd lost my mind, I heard his voice again, this time a whisper on the wind. "Until next time, my dear, and there will be a next time." I didn't wait around to see if he'd make good on that promise. I ran back to the trail, and then down the mountain, not stopping until I reached my car. As I drove away, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I tried to make sense of what had happened. In the days and weeks that followed, I told myself it was just an elaborate trick of the mind. Stress, fatigue, and the gloomy weather had combined to create a terrifying, but ultimately imaginary experience. I almost believed it, but then the dreams started. Night after night, I found myself back on that rain-soaked trail, facing the old man with the black eyes. Sometimes he caught me, his human disguise melting away to reveal something ancient and horrifying. Other times, I managed to escape, only to wake up in a cold sweat, certain he was standing at the foot of my bed. I haven't been hiking since that day. I can't bring myself to set foot on a trail, even in broad daylight with plenty of people around. Because I know, deep in my bones, that he's out there, waiting, watching. And one day, when I least expect it, I'll turn a corner and he'll be there, ready to finish what he started. So if you're ever hiking in the mountains and you come across an old man in a suit, standing dry in the middle of a rainstorm, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. And pray that you're faster than whatever's wearing that human skin. Because some things in this world are older and stranger than we can imagine. And sometimes, they get hungry for a taste of our reality. I was lucky to escape once. I don't think I'll be so fortunate if there's a next time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check the locks on my doors and windows. Again, you can never be too careful when you've caught the attention of something that should not exist in our world. Sleep tight, and remember, sometimes the monsters are real, and they're wearing our faces. The first time I heard the clicking, I thought it was just my imagination. A trick of the wind, perhaps, or the rustle of leaves in the night breeze. But as I continued my evening walk with Max, my loyal German shepherd, the sound grew more persistent, more deliberate. It wasn't until I saw the first glint of reflected light in Max's eyes that I realized we weren't alone on this moonlit trail. I've always been a night owl, finding solace in the quiet hours when the rest of the world sleeps. Our nightly walks had become a ritual, a way to clear my head after long days spent hunched over my laptop, working on my latest novel. The wooded trail near our house was usually deserted at this hour, which suited me just fine. Tonight, though, something felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Max, usually eager to explore every bush and tree, stuck close to my side, his ears pricked forward and alert. The clicking sound came again, louder this time. It reminded me of the noise cicadas make, but wrong somehow. Too rhythmic, too purposeful. I pulled out my phone and switched on its flashlight, sweeping the beam across the path ahead. That's when I saw them. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The trail ahead was moving, undulating like a living carpet. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I realized with growing horror that the ground was covered in spiders. Not just any spiders, but monstrous arachnids the size of dinner plates, their segmented legs clicking against the hard-packed earth as they scuttled towards us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Max let out a low growl, his hackles rising. The spiders, disturbed by the sudden light, began to scatter, some climbing up the trunks of nearby trees, others disappearing into the underbrush. But for every spider that retreated, 2 more seemed to take its place, pouring onto the trail from the darkness beyond. "Max, heal," I whispered, my voice trembling. We needed to get out of here, to turn around and run back the way we came. But as I started to back away, I heard more clicking behind us. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I turned and shone the light back down the trail. More spiders. We were surrounded. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. The spiders hadn't attacked yet, but they were steadily closing in, forming a tightening circle around us. That's when I remembered the pepper spray I always carried in my pocket, a precaution against potential human attackers. Would it work on spiders? I had no idea, but it was the only weapon I had. With shaking hands, I pulled out the small canister. "Max, stay close," I murmured. And then I sprayed a wide arc in front of us, creating a barrier of stinging mist. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The spiders caught in the spray began to thrash wildly, their legs flailing as they emitted high-pitched keening noises I hadn't known spiders could make. The sound sent chills down my spine, but it had created a gap in their ranks. "Now, Max, run!" I shouted, and we bolted through the opening. I could feel the crunch of spider bodies beneath my feet, hear their clicks and screeches as we barreled through their swarm. Max ran ahead, clearing a path, while I followed close behind, spraying pepper spray in wide arcs to keep the creatures at bay. We ran blindly through the woods, veering off the trail in our desperation to escape. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me at every step. But the terror of what pursued us drove me on. The clicking sounds followed, sometimes fading, only to grow louder again as the swarm regrouped and gave chase. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the surreal horror of that night. But eventually, the trees began to thin, and I could see lights ahead. We burst out of the forest and onto a residential street, gasping for breath. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then I heard the clicking again, saw dark shapes scuttling at the edge of the tree line. They weren't giving up. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and desperate. "Somebody, please help us." Porch lights flicked on up and down the street. I saw curtains twitch as curious faces peered out at the commotion. But no one came out. No one opened their doors to the wild-eyed woman and her dog, pursued by horrors they couldn't see. The spiders were advancing now, pouring out of the woods and onto the asphalt. In the stark light of the street lamps, I could see them clearly for the first time. Their bodies were a mottled brown and black, blending perfectly with the forest floor. 8 eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence on each of their hideous faces, and their mandibles. God, their mandibles were massive, dripping with some viscous fluid that sizzled when it hit the pavement. Max barked furiously, snapping at any spider that came too close. But there were too many. For every one he drove back, 3 more took its place. We were being herded, I realized with growing dread, herded back towards the woods. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens. Someone must have called the police. Help was coming, but would it arrive in time? The spiders seemed to sense the approaching threat. Their clicks grew more frenzied, their movements more aggressive. One lunged at Max, latching onto his hind leg. He yelped in pain, trying to shake it off. "No!" I screamed, kicking at the monster. My foot connected, and I felt its exoskeleton crack beneath my shoe. It fell away, green ichor oozing from its broken body. The police car rounded the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The spiders closest to the street retreated, scuttling back towards the shadows. But those behind us pressed forward, more determined than ever to drag us back into their domain. The car screeched to a halt, and 2 officers jumped out, guns drawn. Their eyes widened as they took in the scene before them. "What the hell?" one of them muttered. "Help us," I cried. "Please, they're everywhere." The officers advanced cautiously, their flashlights joining mine in illuminating the horde of monstrous arachnids. I saw doubt and disbelief war with the evidence of their own eyes. "This is impossible," the second officer said, her voice shaking slightly. "Spiders don't get this big." As if to prove her wrong, one of the largest spiders I'd seen yet darted forward with terrifying speed. The officer fired, the gunshot deafeningly loud in the quiet street. The spider's body exploded, showering the pavement with chunks of chitin and that strange green fluid. The sound of the gunshot seemed to break some sort of spell. Lights were coming on in every house now, and I could hear shouts and screams as people finally saw what was happening. More sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The spiders, perhaps realizing their opportunity was slipping away, surged forward in one last desperate attack. I saw one leap impossibly high, aiming for the male officer's face. Without thinking, I swung my arm, pepper spray at the ready. The spray caught the spider in midair, and it fell writhing to the ground. "Fall back," the female officer shouted. "Get in the car, now." Max and I didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled into the back of the police cruiser, the officers diving into the front seats a moment later. As we peeled away from the curb, I looked back to see the swarm of spiders retreating into the woods, melting away into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, medical examinations, and disbelief. Max's leg was treated for the spider bite, while I was checked for shock and any injuries I might have missed in the adrenaline-fueled escape. The police took my statement, though I could tell they were struggling to believe what they'd seen with their own eyes. By the time dawn broke, the woods had been cordoned off and teams of scientists and government officials were swarming the area. They found evidence of the spiders, shed exoskeletons, strange webbing, and the bodies of the ones we'd killed. But of living specimens, there was no sign. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Or as normal as it could be after such an experience. The official explanation was that the spiders were a previously unknown species, driven from their natural habitat by deforestation or climate change. It was a neat, tidy explanation that allowed people to sleep at night. But I knew the truth. I had seen the intelligence in those gleaming eyes, felt the purposefulness of their attack. These weren't just animals acting on instinct. They were hunting us, testing us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting. I don't go for walks at night anymore. Max and I stick to well-lit areas, never venturing near the woods after dark. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear it. That soft, menacing click, click, click. And I wonder, with a shiver of dread, when they'll come for us again. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We thought we were alone, just 4 stupid teenagers looking for a thrill. But as the chanting grew louder and the flickering firelight danced between the trees, I realized with growing horror that we had stumbled into something far more sinister than we could have ever imagined. It was supposed to be a simple night of rebellion. My best friend Jake had the brilliant idea of sneaking out to explore the old Johnson property, a sprawling woodland estate that had been abandoned for years. Local legends spoke of ghosts, cult activity, and all sorts of spooky nonsense that we, in our infinite teenage wisdom, found irresistible. So there we were. Jake, his girlfriend Lily, my crush Sarah, and me, armed with nothing but our phone flashlights and an unhealthy dose of overconfidence. We scaled the rusty gate and entered the forbidden grounds. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect. We wandered through overgrown paths, giggling nervously at every creaking branch and rustling leaf. Jake tried to scare us with exaggerated ghost stories, while Lily rolled her eyes and pretended not to be scared. Sarah stayed close to me, which I didn't mind one bit. It wasn't until we were deep in the heart of the property that things started to feel off. The air grew thick and heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals, fell silent. Even Jake's incessant chatter died down, as we all sensed that something wasn't right. That's when we saw the first flicker of light through the trees. "What's that?" Sarah whispered, gripping my arm tightly. "Probably just some other kids," Jake said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Come on, let's check it out." Every instinct told me to turn back, to grab Sarah's hand and run as fast as we could back to the safety of our homes. But peer pressure is a powerful thing, and I didn't want to look like a coward in front of her. So I swallowed my fear and followed Jake deeper into the woods. As we got closer, we could hear voices. Low, rhythmic chanting that sent chills down my spine. The flickering light resolved into a bonfire, casting twisted shadows on the surrounding trees. And around that fire, I'll never forget what I saw next. A circle of robed figures, their faces hidden by dark hoods, swayed in time to the chanting. In the center of the circle stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with what I prayed wasn't blood. We crouched behind a thick clump of bushes, too terrified to move or speak. I could feel Sarah trembling next to me, hear Lily's sharp intake of breath. Even Jake, for once in his life, was struck speechless. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied. One of the robed figures stepped forward, raising a wicked-looking dagger high above their head. In that moment, I was certain we were about to witness a human sacrifice. But then everything went to hell. Lily, overcome by fear or revulsion, let out a strangled cry. The chanting stopped abruptly, and every hooded head turned in our direction. "Run!" Jake yelled, grabbing Lily's hand and bolting. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we took off, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting as much distance between us and that nightmarish scene as possible. I could hear shouts behind us, the crashing of multiple people pursuing through the woods. My lungs burned and branches whipped at my face, but terror drove me on. Sarah stumbled, and I hauled her to her feet, practically dragging her along. "We have to split up," Jake called from somewhere to my left. "Meet back at the gate." It was a terrible idea, but in the chaos of the moment, it seemed to make sense. Jake and Lily veered off to the right, while Sarah and I continued straight ahead. The sounds of pursuit seemed to fade, but I didn't dare slow down. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing behind a fallen tree, gasping for breath. What was that?" Sarah panted, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to get out of here, now." We oriented ourselves as best we could and started making our way towards where we thought the gate should be. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us freezing in terror, certain we were about to be discovered. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we saw the moonlight glinting off the metal of the gate. Relief flooded through me. We had made it. But as we approached, my heart sank. Jake and Lily were nowhere to be seen. "We can't leave them," Sarah said, voicing my thoughts. I nodded grimly. "We'll wait 5 more minutes. If they don't show up." I didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew we couldn't stay here much longer. Those 5 minutes were the longest of my life. Every second felt like an eternity as we strained our ears for any sign of our friends. The forest seemed to press in around us, full of hidden threats and unseen eyes. Just as I was about to suggest we leave, we heard it, the sound of someone running towards us. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by icy dread as I realized it was only one set of footsteps. Lily burst out of the darkness, her face streaked with tears and blood. "They got Jake," she sobbed. "We have to go now." I wanted to argue, to insist we go back for him. But one look at Lily's terror-stricken face told me all I needed to know. Whatever had happened to Jake, we couldn't help him now. We scrambled over the gate and ran to where we had hidden our bikes. As we pedaled furiously down the dark country road, I kept expecting to hear the sounds of pursuit, to see robed figures emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing but the sound of our labored breathing and the crunch of gravel under our tires. We didn't stop until we reached my house, the closest of our homes. We burst through the door, startling my parents awake. Through tears and gasping breaths, we tried to explain what had happened. Of course, they didn't believe us. How could they? It sounded insane, like something out of a bad horror movie. They called the police, reported Jake missing, but I could see the skepticism in the officers' eyes as we recounted our story. Days passed. Search parties combed the Johnson property but found nothing. No evidence of cult activity, no sign of Jake. It was as if that night had never happened. Lily withdrew into herself, barely speaking to anyone. Sarah avoided me, as if my presence was a reminder of that terrifying night. And me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those robed figures, heard that chilling chant. A week after that night, I received a text from an unknown number. My blood ran cold as I read the message. "We're always watching. You can't hide forever." I deleted the message, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was true. Whatever we had stumbled upon that night, it wasn't over. They were out there, waiting, watching. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear that chant again carried on the wind. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just the trauma playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. We weren't supposed to escape that night, and sooner or later, they'll come for us again. All I can do is wait, and wonder which of us will be next. So if you're ever tempted to go exploring in the woods at night, to seek out the thrill of the unknown, take it from me. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, because once you've seen what lurks in the shadows, you can never unsee it, and you can never truly escape. The first howl pierced the night like a knife, freezing the blood in my veins. I'd heard wolves before, but this was different. As the sound echoed through the dark forest, I knew with chilling certainty that whatever made that noise was no ordinary wolf, and it was hunting me. I never should have come to these woods alone, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name's Alex, and I've always been an avid hiker and outdoorsman. Growing up in Montana, I spent more time in the wilderness than I did in civilization. I prided myself on my survival skills, on being able to navigate any terrain and handle any situation. That pride would be my downfall. It was supposed to be a routine weekend trip, a chance to test out some new gear before a longer expedition I had planned for next month. I chose a remote area in the Bitterroot National Forest, a place I'd been to a few times before but never fully explored. The plan was to hike in Friday afternoon, spend 2 nights camping, and hike out Sunday. The first day went smoothly. I made good time on the trail, enjoying the solitude and the crisp autumn air. As the sun began to set, I found a suitable clearing and set up camp. I built a small fire, heated up some freeze-dried stroganoff, and settled in for the night. That's when things started to feel off. It began with a sense of unease, a prickling at the back of my neck like I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual hyper-awareness that comes with being alone in the wilderness. But as the night wore on, the feeling intensified. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, fell eerily silent. Even the crackling of my campfire seemed muted, as if the very air was holding its breath. I found myself straining my ears, trying to catch any sound that might explain the oppressive silence. Just as I was about to give up and try to get some sleep, I heard it. A twig snapping somewhere in the darkness beyond my firelight. I sat up straight, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at my belt. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Is someone there?" No response, just another snap. Closer this time, followed by a low, rumbling growl that was definitely not from any bear or mountain lion I'd ever encountered. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around the edges of my camp, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, just endless dark trees. That's when the first howl came, the one I mentioned earlier. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. It was joined by another, then another, until the air was filled with an otherworldly chorus that chilled me to my core. I didn't wait to see what was making those sounds. I grabbed my backpack, kicked dirt over my fire, and ran. Looking back, I know how stupid that was. Running in a panic through an unfamiliar forest at night is a recipe for disaster. But in that moment, blind terror overrode all common sense and survival training. All I knew was that I had to get away from those howls. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and whatever was back there as possible. How long I ran, I couldn't say. Time lost all meaning in the darkness and the fear. But eventually, my lungs burning and legs shaking, I had to stop. I leaned against a tree, gasping for breath, and tried to get my bearings. The howls had stopped, or at least I could no longer hear them. But the silence that replaced them was almost worse. I fumbled for my compass, hoping to at least figure out which direction I'd been running. But as the needle spun wildly, never settling on a direction, I realized with growing dread that something was very, very wrong. A twig snapped behind me and I whirled around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something, a flash of gray fur, a glint of yellow eyes, before it darted out of sight. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Morny, what do you want?" A low chuckle answered me, a sound that was almost human but not quite. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me. "We want you, Alex," a gravelly voice said from the shadows. "We've been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." Ice flooded my veins. How did it know my name? And what did it mean? Someone like me? I didn't stick around to find out. I took off running again. No destination in mind, just a desperate need to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, driven in a specific direction by unseen forces. As I burst through a thick patch of underbrush, I found myself in a small clearing. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, their surfaces covered in strange, swirling symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. And surrounding the circle were the creatures. They were wolf-like in shape, but much larger than any wolf I'd ever seen. Their fur was a mottled gray and black, hanging in matted clumps from bodies that seemed too thin, too angular to be natural. But it was their eyes that truly terrified me, glowing yellow orbs filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. I stood frozen, trapped between fear and disbelief. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't exist outside of movies and nightmares. The largest of the creatures, a massive beast with a scar running down its muzzle, stepped forward. As I watched in horror, its body began to change. Bones cracked and reformed, fur receded, until a man stood before me, naked, wild-looking, with those same yellow eyes. "Welcome, Alex," he said, his voice the same gravelly tone I'd heard in the woods. "We've been expecting you." What are you?" I managed to stammer. He smiled, revealing teeth that were still too sharp, too animal to be human. We are the guardians of these woods, the keepers of ancient secrets, and now you will join us. No, I said, backing away. No, this isn't real. This can't be happening. Oh, but it is, he said, advancing on me. You humans have forgotten the old ways, forgotten the price that must be paid to walk in these wild places, but we remember, and we will teach you. The other creatures, werewolves, I realized with a jolt of terror, began to close in around me. I looked for an escape route, but there was nowhere to run. I was surrounded. As the leader reached for me, his hands already beginning to transform back into claws, I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until black spots danced at the edges of my vision. And then, miraculously, I heard another sound. A helicopter. Search and rescue. In my blind panic, I must have activated the emergency beacon on my satellite communicator. The werewolves snarled in frustration, their heads turning toward the sound of approaching rescue. In that moment of distraction, I saw my chance. I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life, towards the sound of salvation. I don't remember much of what happened next. I have vague memories of bursting out of the tree line, of blinding searchlights and concerned voices. I babbled about werewolves in stone circles, but of course, no one believed me. They put it down to dehydration and exposure, a bad case of getting spooked in the woods. It's been months since that night, and I haven't set foot in the wilderness since. I tell myself it was all a hallucination, a trick of fear and exhaustion. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can hear distant howls, and I know, deep in my bones, that they're still out there, waiting, watching. So if you ever find yourself alone in the deep woods, and you hear a howl that sounds a little too human, run, run, and don't look back, because some things in this world are better left undiscovered, some hunts better left unfinished, and some nights in the forest, some nights you don't come back from at all. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to my nostrils as I stared at the severed deer leg lying at the foot of our tent. My hands shook as I reached for my phone to wake Sarah. This wasn't a gift. It was a warning. It had all started 3 days ago when Sarah and I decided to take a camping trip to celebrate our anniversary. We'd been together for 5 years, and the last 2 had been rough. Between her grueling residency at the hospital and my startup's constant demands, we barely had time for each other anymore. This trip was supposed to fix that all, to remind us why we fell in love in the first place. We chose a remote spot in the Cascade Mountains, far from cell service and the pressures of our daily lives. The first day was perfect. We hiked, laughed, and reconnected in ways we hadn't in months. As the sun set, we built a campfire and toasted marshmallows, feeling like teenagers again. That night, curled up in our sleeping bags, I heard it, a soft rustling outside our tent. Probably just a raccoon. Sarah murmured sleepily when I mentioned it. I nodded, but something about the sound had set me on edge. It was too deliberate, too measured to be an animal foraging for food. The next morning, we awoke to find a small pile of acorns arranged neatly in front of our tent. Ah, how cute, Sarah cooed. The forest critters left us breakfast. I forced a smile, but my unease from the night before returned. The acorns were placed too precisely, forming a perfect circle. No animal I knew of did that. We spent the day exploring a nearby waterfall, and for a while, I forgot about the strange occurrence. But as we hiked back to our campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed to follow us. That night, the rustling returned, louder this time. I lay awake for hours, straining my ears, but whatever was out there remained just out of sight. The third morning brought another gift, a collection of wildflowers, their stems snapped rather than picked, arranged in an intricate pattern outside our tent. Sarah was delighted, but I felt a chill run down my spine. This was no animal's doing. Maybe we should pack up and head home early, I suggested, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Sarah looked at me, concern etched on her face. Is everything okay, Jake? You've been on edge since we got here. I hesitated, not wanting to worry her unnecessarily. It's nothing, just a weird feeling, that's all. She squeezed my hand. If you're sure. But let's stay one more night, okay? We drove all this way, and I'm really enjoying our time together. I nodded, unable to resist her hopeful smile. But as we hiked that day, I made sure to keep Sarah close, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. That night, the sounds outside our tent were unmistakable, heavy footsteps circling us, pausing occasionally as if listening. I clutched our only weapon, a small camping knife, and feeling woefully unprepared. Jake, Sarah whispered, fear finally creeping into her voice. What's out there? I don't know, I admitted, but whatever it is, it's been watching us since we got here. We huddled together, barely breathing, as the footsteps continued their rounds. Eventually, they faded into the distance, but neither of us slept a wink that night. Which brings us to this morning, and the severed deer leg lying in a pool of congealing blood outside our tent. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as she took in the grisly scene. We need to leave. Now. I nodded, already starting to break down the tent. We packed in record time, constantly glancing over our shoulders. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, as if the entire forest had eyes trained on us. As we shouldered our backpacks, a twig snapped loudly in the underbrush. We froze, staring at the spot where the sound had come from. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A flash of pale skin, a glint of feral eyes. But it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. Run, I whispered, grabbing Sarah's hand. We took off down the trail, our heavy packs bouncing painfully against our backs. The sound of pursuit was immediate, crashing through the underbrush, gaining on us with inhuman speed. Sarah stumbled, crying out in pain. I hauled her to her feet, urging her on. We're almost there, I lied, having no idea how far we were from the trailhead. A howl rose behind us, a sound so filled with hunger and rage that it chilled me to my core. It was answered by more howls, coming from all around us. We were surrounded. The river, Sarah gasped, pointing ahead. Maybe we can lose them in the water. It was our only chance. We veered off the trail, crashing through the undergrowth towards the sound of rushing water. The river came into view, its waters swollen from recent rains. Without hesitation, we plunged in. The icy water stole my breath, but fear drove me on. We swam with the current, letting it carry us downstream and away from our pursuers. As we rounded a bend, I risked a glance back. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. Standing on the bank were 3 figures, but they were like no humans I'd ever seen. Their bodies were emaciated, skin stretched tight over elongated limbs. Matted hair hung in tangles around faces that were more animal than human. But it was their eyes that terrified me most, glowing with an otherworldly hunger, fixed on us as we were swept away. We managed to drag ourselves out of the river a mile downstream, shivering and exhausted, but we didn't dare stop. We stumbled through the forest, jumping at every sound, certain that those things were still after us. It was nearly dark when we finally reached the trailhead. Our car sat there, a beautiful sight of normality in the midst of our nightmare. We threw our packs in the trunk and peeled out of there, tires spinning on the gravel. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw those glowing eyes watching us from the tree line. But then we rounded a corner, and the forest was lost from view. We drove in silence for a long time, both of us trying to process what had happened. It wasn't until we were back in cell service range that Sarah spoke. "We need to report this," she said, her voice shaky. Whatever those things were, they're dangerous. Other campers could be at risk. I nodded, but a part of me knew it would be useless. Who would believe our story? We had no proof, no evidence of what we'd seen, and a bigger part of me just wanted to forget, to pretend it had never happened. We did file a report with the park rangers, carefully omitting the more unbelievable aspects of our encounter. They promised to investigate, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. To them, we were just another couple spooked by the woods. In the weeks that followed, we tried to move on. We threw ourselves into work, avoiding any mention of our camping trip. But the nightmares persisted. Visions of glowing eyes and severed limbs, of being hunted through endless dark forests. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself researching the area where we'd camped. Most of what I found was typical tourist information, but buried in an old forum thread, I discovered something chilling. There were stories, stretching back decades, of hikers going missing in those woods, of strange sounds in the night and unexplained gifts left at campsites. Some blamed it on a lost tribe, others on some unknown species of predator, but the details were eerily familiar. I showed Sarah, and I saw the same realization dawn in her eyes. We weren't the first to encounter those things, and we likely wouldn't be the last. We've talked about going to the media, about trying to warn people, but who would believe us? We'd be laughed off as crazies or attention seekers, so we stay silent, carrying the weight of our knowledge. But every time I see a news report about another missing hiker, I wonder, and every time I smell wood smoke or hear a twig snap in the darkness, I'm back there, running for my life through those endless woods. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I find myself wondering if we truly escaped, or if those things are still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to reclaim their prey. One thing I know for certain, I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some gifts are better left unopened, some mysteries better left unsolved, and some predators are best left undisturbed in the dark heart of the forest.